Today we talk about one of the most important and famous military units in the Roman Empire. Last time we talked about the Frumentari. Today we will talk about the Praetorian Guard, the Imperial Guards. Why did these names endure, these roles? First of all, the Roman Empire had strong bones. Institutions made it last, not necessarily people, since the Roman Empire was able to survive a number of crazy generals, emperors, governors, people that would have easily toppled completely a lesser empire. So what makes these units unique is not their battlefield role or their incredible ability to kill, not even their skill to fulfill their role. It's the fact that these units became part of the structure of the state itself, the bones of the Roman Empire. And none of them are closer to the head than the Praetorians. The idea of a personal guard was not born with Augustus, founder of the Praetorian Guard. It has roots in the Republic, during a time when the very notion of monarchy was still poison in the Roman imagination. Even at the time, Roman generals often surrounded themselves with hand-picked soldiers for protection, known as the cohors praetoria, the Praetorian Court. These were not yet a formal unit, but rather an ad hoc group, a trusted ring of veterans and aides de camp assigned to protect a commander on campaign. Scipio Africanus had them, so did Marius. Even Julius Caesar maintained his own informal bodyguard, composed not only of legionaries, but at times even Germanic warriors, men considered so distant from Roman politics that they were thought incorruptible. But these were not palace guards, they guarded tents, not thrones, and they didn't have any legal difference from other soldiers. They were just people doing a job. It was only with Gaius Octavius, soon to become Augustus, that the Praetorian Guard emerged as a prominent force, stationary, institutional, and embedded within the very fabric of Roman power. And that creation wasn't just about protection, but control. Augustus, victorious after the civil wars, understood the fragility of his position. He had restored peace in Rome, yes, but at the price of the Republic. He could not be king, at least not in name. We'll talk about this in detail soon when we talk about the Second Civil War, or Third, depending on how you see it. His solution was a brilliant sleight of hand. He retained the forms of the Republic while keeping absolute power cloaked in legalism and tradition. And for that to work, he needed a personal military force, unlike anything the Republic had tolerated, in Rome. Thus, the Praetorian Guard was born. Not a security detail per se, but a political instrument designed to protect the emperor, enforce his will, let's underline this part, and signal his supremacy to everyone. After all, before Augustus, no one could bear military uniforms in Rome. Urban warfare was fought with ex-gladiators and people with knives. It was more of a guerrilla situation than a real military operation. This was about to change. It is through the words of Cassius Dio that we know that Augustus initially stationed the guard discreetly, not within the city itself, but in scattered detachments throughout Italy. It was a compromise, one that masked military reality behind a civilian face. The Roman population, ever weary of standing armies within the city, could be pacified, but the soldiers were close enough to intervene if needed. At the early stage, the guard consisted of 9 cohorts, each nominally composed of 500 to 1,000 men. Unlike the legions, which were largely drawn from the provinces, the Praetorians were recruited almost exclusively from Italy, especially Etruria, Latium, and Campania. Right now, Etruria would be around Tuscany and a little bit more to the north, and Latium, of course, is Lazio. This was deliberate. Augustus wanted men whose loyalty lay with him, not with some distant provincial commander. He paid them well, extremely well. A Praetorian earned 3 times the salary of a regular legionary and served only 16 years, compared to the legion's 25. They were awarded generous bonuses on retirement and often granted land or cash. Citing Guy de la Bédoyère, pardon my pronunciation, they were the elite of the elite, but not always because of their fighting skills. It was about trust, or at least about control." End quote. That distinction would define the Guard identity for centuries. They were soldiers, yes, but they were also symbols. Their presence in public ceremonies, lining imperial processions, standing guard at the emperor's side, was a living reminder of where real power now resides. And yet the Guard, in these early years, did not operate alone. It was placed under the command of 2 Praetorian prefects, equestrian officers chosen by the emperor himself. Let's remember the equestrians were the higher middle class of the time. These men were not senators, and this was by no accident. By excluding the senatorial class, the patricians, Augustus ensured that the command of his private army remained a direct extension of the imperial household and not the old aristocracy. One of the earliest and most important of these men was Quintus Ostorius Scapula. He was important but never became really famous because his loyalty was rewarded not with fame but with quiet, lasting trust, a model Augustus hoped others would follow. But the equilibrium would not last. The Praetorian prefect would become a very public figure and change the history of the empire forever. But before we delve into the history of these people, these prefects, the most front-facing part of the Praetorian Guard, let's go through what they actually are. The image of the Praetorian Guard is iconic. Gleaming helmets, crested armor, a silent phalanx flanking the emperor as he walks among marble columns. They appear in statues, in frescoes, and in film. Disciplined, loyal, deadly. Rome's most elite soldiers. But was that image ever real? After all, we today have a passion for elite combat unit. We want to see them everywhere. And yet often reality is a little bit more grounded than what we'd like for it to be. The Praetorians were of course better paid. They were better housed and better positioned than any other troop in the empire. But that didn't always make them better soldiers. They were elite in privilege, not always in skill. Let's begin with recruitment. From Augustus onward, Praetorians were drawn largely from central Italy, especially Etruria, Latium, Umbria, Campania. We've already talked about this. This automatically meant that these people were often far less seasoned and more socially connected than soldiers coming from Pannonia, Syria, Germania, all the areas where the actual fighting was going on. Historian Stephen Dando Collins argues that the Praetorian Guard was selected not for physical prowess, but because of their recommendations from local patrons or family connections to the equestrian class. It was a good cushy job after all, putting one very near the center of power and with an extremely good pay, around 225 denarii per year, under Augustus. Under Domitian, it reached 1.5k sesterces annually. Furthermore, there was a special bonus that would probably change Roman history far more than many other things, the donativum, a one-time bonus given every time a new emperor was crowned. You can imagine why this probably was a mistake. With this level of reward, one might expect rigorous standards of training, but the Guard's military activity was minimal. Most Praetorians never saw a battlefield. Their duties were concentrated in and around Rome, where, well, nothing happened. Particularly after the construction of the Castra Praetoria under Tiberius in 23 AD. This massive fortified barracks on the edge of the city became their permanent home, a symbol of their presence and their proximity to power. Inside the city, the Guard served as ceremonial escort, palace sentries, and urban enforcer. They manned checkpoints, guarded treasuries, patrolled the imperial palace, and arrested enemies of the state. Occasionally, they were deployed to crush dissent, like during the food riots or succession crisis, but rarely to wage extended campaigns abroad. Now, there were exceptions, but they didn't shine as good examples of military prowess. At the Battle of Bedriacum in 69 AD, during the Year of the Four Emperors, Praetorian cohorts loyal to Otto faced off against the hardened troops of Vitellius. The Praetorians broke under pressure, suffering a humiliating defeat that called their martial reputation into question. Tacitus, never one to flatter, described them as confident in appearance but lacking the endurance of true soldiers. In response, Vitellius disbanded the entire guard, but they returned within months, re-established by his successor Vespasian, who knew their political utility outweighed their failures in the field. Their equipment was mostly standard issue: the gladius, scutum, pilum. The lorica segmentata covered their body. It was higher quality gear, of course. Stylized tunics for public ceremonies were worn. They trained regularly, but not with the same rigor or urgency as frontier legions. And, well, regularly doesn't mean as much. Now, putting an end to our "let's humiliate the Praetorians" moment, they were not useless, they were just adequate enough to do their job. There are examples of some of them coming from veteran ranks and who had seen real war, but as a whole, in general, the Guard was never Rome's best in terms of combat skill. So, for the first few decades of its existence, the Praetorian Guard did what it was designed to do: protect the person of the emperor, uphold public order, and protect the majesty of imperial authority. But proximity breeds influence, and the high-stakes games of Roman politics meant that the presence of armed men changed the game. Now, their first taste of political influence came sooner than Augustus would have liked to imagine. After his death in 14 AD, Tiberius ascended the throne of the Principate. But it wasn't a smooth transition. Augustus' stepson rose into trouble. The Senate hesitated. Tiberius played coy, trying to convince everyone he was reluctant to ascend to the role. But in the end, it was the Praetorian Guard, now fully consolidated and stationed near Rome, who made clear that they stood behind Tiberius. Tacitus, in his Annals, tells us that Tiberius seemed to hesitate and delay until the tribunes of the guard and centurions gave open support. The sword stood behind the new princeps, and the message was unmistakable. From that moment on, no emperor would ignore the guard. Their loyalty had to be purchased, maintained, and feared. Things rapidly precipitated under Tiberius with the ascension of a man, Lucius Aelius Sejanus. Now, to understand how Sejanus rose, you must understand the nature of power under Tiberius. When Augustus died in 14 AD, Tiberius inherited the empire with reluctance, or so he claimed. Tacitus, ever suspicious, writes that Tiberius, though master of the whole empire, carefully disguised the fact. The new emperor preferred to rule by distance, through letters, commands, and trusted men, and no one was more trusted than Sejanus. Sejanus was not born in power. He came from the equestrian order, the son of a Roman knight who had served Augustus loyally. But by skill, instinct, and flattery, he found himself appointed Praetorian Prefect, alongside his father's old comrade Strabo. When Strabo was dispatched to Egypt, Sejanus took sole command of the guard, a first in Roman history. Now finding himself in a uniquely powerful position, Sejanus put himself to work to transform the institution of the Praetorian Prefect. The guard, until then dispersed across Italy as we said, was brought together in a single fortified encampment in Rome, the Castra Praetoria we already cited. The project was completed in 23 AD on the city's outskirts. You can today find a metro station right there, Castro Pretorio. By consolidating the guard into one base, Sejanus gave himself and any future prefect a private army inside the city walls. But more than troops, he had access. Tiberius trusted him implicitly. As the emperor grew weary of the burden of office, Sejanus handled petitions, chose appointments, whispered suspicions. He sat beside the emperor during public appearances. He received foreign ambassadors. He was, for all intents and purposes, Rome's silent regent. He was so powerful his ambition began to soar. And here we go into trouble. Tiberius' only son died suddenly. Ancient sources like Tacitus and Cassius Dio allege that Sejanus, hungry for succession, poisoned him. With the help of Drusus' own wife, Livilla, who had become Sejanus' lover. Whether this is slander or truth is still debated, but what is certain is that after Drusus' death, Sejanus moved openly to pursue imperial power. So he either killed him or took advantage of the death. In order to proceed with his ambitions, he needed to marry Livilla, a member of the imperial family. Tiberius was at first hesitant. He refused, but made no move to check Sejanus' influence. In 26 AD, the emperor withdrew from Rome entirely, retiring to the island of Capri, and naturally leaving Sejanus in control of the capital. From this remote palace, Tiberius ruled by letter, letters written, delivered, or interpreted by Sejanus. The prefect wielded the powers of censorship. Treason trials and executions were within his reach. He purged the Senate of enemies, imprisoned or killed rivals, and promoted his allies. As Tacitus wrote, the city was full of spies, of accusations without evidence, of arrests in the night. By 30 AD, Sejanus was consul-elect. Some sources suggest he hoped to marry into the imperial family yet and be named co-emperor or regent. He had reached the apex of power. And then he vanished. On October 18, 31 AD, Tiberius sent a letter to the Senate. In it, he praised Sejanus' loyalty. He described his achievements. The senators relaxed. Some began congratulating Sejanus prematurely. It was done. He was gonna be co-emperor. But the letter continued, and slowly its tone darkened. It questioned Sejanus' motives. It alluded to ambition. It hinted at betrayal. And then came the command. Sejanus was to be arrested. What followed was chaos. The guard, under the new prefect, Macro, seized the former commander. Sejanus, once the most powerful man in Rome, was dragged from the Curia and strangled that night. His corpse was cast down the Gemonian stairs, his name erased from inscriptions, his family hunted down. Even Livilla, his alleged co-conspirator, was forced to starve herself to death by imperial decree. Tacitus describes the aftermath with cold finality. So perished Sejanus, once so mighty, and men went about openly declaring their joy, as though liberated from slavery. Now, you might ask, why did the cohort, the Praetorians, turn on Sejanus so easily? Well, Sejanus had made the Praetorian prefect a powerful role, meaning a lot of other people wanted it. So, in being so influential, in proving how powerful he could be, he had created rivals. He had created a good reason, a good leverage, to put him down. If you think about it in a smaller way, this explains Augustus. The way Augustus created the Principate, how he acquiesced to the various powers of the empire, how he never really called himself emperor or truly, openly moved to take absolute power. Ruling through previously existent roles was a very good way to mask oneself in the shadows, and in Rome, an emperor needed the shadows to survive. After Sejanus, the Guard did not retreat from politics. If anything, they grew more confident in their power. The emperors who followed Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, Nero, each came to understand the same dangerous truth. When Caligula was murdered in 41 AD, stabbed in a hallway by disgruntled officers, the Senate attempted to restore the Republic, but they had miscalculated. The Guard did not support senatorial fantasies of liberty. They wanted continuity, stability, and perhaps, most of all, compensation. Suetonius tells us that in the aftermath of the assassination, Praetorian troops searching the palace found Claudius, Caligula's uncle, trembling behind a curtain. They proclaimed him emperor on the spot, escorted him to the Castra Praetoria, and declared their loyalty in exchange for a generous donativum, the cash gift we have talked about earlier. The Senate could only watch as things just happened. Now, this set an important precedent. The Praetorians could end an emperor and could make one. They were the Kingmakers. This wasn't just a matter of conspiracy of force, it became institutional. Emperors began budgeting donatives as standard expenses at their ascension. When Nero came to power in 54 AD, his mother, Agrippina, who orchestrated the succession, ensured the Guard was paid well and celebrated in public ceremony. Suetonius reports that Nero lavished them with promises of bonuses and honors, a calculated flattery to win their undivided loyalty. But loyalty had a price, and it was quickly rising. By the late 1st century, the Guard began to sense its leverage. Domitian, increasingly paranoid and authoritarian, relied on them heavily, not just for protection but for suppression. His fear of plots turned the Guard into his surveillance apparatus. They executed senators, enforced censorship, raided homes. And yet, even the favor of a despot was no guarantee for safety. When Domitian was killed in 96 AD in a palace conspiracy, the Guard's commander, Petronius Secundus, was murdered by his own men, not for plotting against the emperor, but for failing to protect him. In their eyes, they had a good thing going with Domitian, so he and his incompetence had robbed them. Now let me just stop for a second and just say that everything about Domitian's reign is to be heard with a big question mark because of the sources. Only his enemies wrote about him, and well, they hated him a lot. This degeneration of the Praetorian Guard reached its apex in 193 AD. That year, the Emperor Pertinax, a respected general and reformer, was elevated by the Senate after the assassination of the corrupt Commodus. Pertinax tried to restore discipline, and the Guard would have been hit by this. He tried to cut their excess privileges, demanded real training, and promised reform. The response came swiftly. Barely 3 months into his reign, a detachment of Praetorians stormed the palace and killed him. He had been emperor for a grand total of 86 days. And then came the unimaginable. According to Cassius Dio, the Praetorian Guard put the empire up for sale. In the Castra Praetoria, they opened the gates and invited bids for anyone with ambition, and the goal to seize the throne. The two contenders were Titus Flavius Sulpicianus, the prefect of the city, and a wealthy senator named Didius Julianus. Julianus in the end won, promising 25,000 sesterces per soldier, an enormous sum, over 10 years of pay per man. He was escorted to the Senate and declared emperor, not because of his experience, not because of his popularity, but because he had purchased the loyalty of Rome's bodyguard. The Roman populace was horrified. Dio records that the people shouted from the streets, This is not an emperor, but a merchant! But they had overestimated themselves. The provincial legions, battle-hardened and proud, were enraged. They would never serve a man who bought power like a slave in the marketplace. And so began the rise of Septimius Severus, governor of Pannonia, who marched his legions toward Rome with the promise of vengeance. The guard, faced with real soldiers, did not fight, they surrendered, begged for mercy and were disbanded. Severus executed the murderers of Pertinax, stripped the remaining Praetorians of their arms and uniforms, and replaced them with his own loyal troops from the provinces, men who had fought under him for years. As Dio puts it, he took the arms from the unworthy and gave them to men who had earned them. It should have been the end of the guard, but it wasn't. Severus had reformed the corps, but not eliminated the position. The guard returned, reshaped, and still standing in the shadow of Imperial Palace. The new Praetorian Guard under Septimius Severus was different. It was not an urban garrison anymore, it was a militarized inner circle, no longer Italian, no longer connected to the aristocracy of Rome. And yet, the office of Praetorian Prefect did not shrink, it grew. Severus' own prefect, Gaius Fulvius Platianus, became so powerful he overshadowed the imperial family. The historian Herodian writes that Platanius' word was law. His hand was in control of appointments, promotions, and executions. Ironically, just like Sejanus, he was executed in 205 AD for plotting against the Severan dynasty. But the pattern remained. The guard's commanders increasingly operated like viceroys in Rome, often with little oversight. By the 3rd century, the cracks were visible everywhere. Between 235 and 284 AD, the Roman Empire saw over 25 emperors, most of whom died violently. It was the crisis of the 3rd century, a time of invasions, plagues, economic collapse, and constant military revolts, something, honestly, I wanna do a video about. In this maelstrom, the Praetorian Guard, once a gatekeeper of stability, became yet another actor in the power struggle. They installed and removed emperors at will. Some historians even speak of a barracks monarchy, where rulers rose and fell on the preference of the soldiers, Praetorians chief among them, just because they were near. Consider Philip the Arab, who rose to power in 244 AD, likely with guards' support, only to be killed in 249 when his troop turned to Decius, or Popenus and Balbinus, installed by the Senate in 238 AD, but murdered by the guard itself after only a few months in power, dragged from the imperial palace and cut down in the streets. Their deaths were not accidents of policy, they were warnings, and yet emperors could not simply abolish the guard, not without exposing themselves to even greater risk. And so, they tolerated it, fed it, feared it. But the longer the empire endured this dance, the more obvious it became that something had to change. That change began with Diocletian. When he came to power in 284 AD, Diocletian understood that the empire was too large, too fractured, and too unstable to be ruled from a single palace by a single person. He created the Tetrarchy, dividing the empire between 2 Augusti and 2 Caesars, 4 emperors in practice, each with their own court, their own military staff, and their own administrative capital. The Praetorian Guard remained in Rome, but Rome itself was no longer central to imperial power. More importantly, Diocletian began to weaken the Guard structurally. He created new imperial escorts, the Protectores Domestici, elite cavalry units drawn from the field armies, and emphasized loyalty to the emperor's person, not the Roman capital. Rome was now a ceremonial seat, not a command center. Still, the Praetorian Guard endured, but it was out of step with the realities of the empire. They had become an expensive relic, living on reputation and tradition. That tradition came to a final violent end under Constantine the Great. In 312 AD, Constantine marched on Rome to challenge Maxentius, a rival who claimed the Western imperial title. Maxentius, unlike Diocletian or Constantine, relied heavily on the old Rome-based institutions, the Senate, the urban prefecture, and most of all, the Praetorian Guard. The final confrontation came at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, just outside the city. Constantine's army crushed Maxentius' forces. The Guard fought fiercely. This was one of the few moments in late history when they stood in the field. But they could not stop the advance. Maxentius drowned in the Tiber, as his men tried to retreat across the collapsing bridge. After entering Rome in triumph, Constantine enacted the final sentence. He dissolved the Praetorian Guard, razed their camp, and banned their name from service. Zosimus, Historia Nova. So our story is done. The Castra Praetoria, the Praetorian Guard camp, built nearly 300 years earlier by Sejanus, was demolished, stone by stone. No more elite bodyguard in the capital, no more kingmakers, no more auctioning of the empire. And yet, while the guard itself was obliterated, the office of Praetorian Prefect survived. Why? We have said at the beginning of this video that the way units became long-lived in the Roman Empire was to embed themselves in the civil structure of the state. In the 4th century, the Praetorian Prefect had already evolved from a military commander into something else entirely, a civil administrator, a chief of staff, and eventually the highest non-imperial office in the empire. Let's trace the evolution. By the 3rd century, especially under Gallienus and Diocletian, military command had increasingly been separated from civilian governance. Field generals, duces, commanded the legions. The Praetorian Prefect remained in the emperor's inner circle, but now oversaw finance, taxation, law, and imperial correspondence. Under Constantine, this administrative role was formalized and expanded. There were now multiple Praetorian Prefects, each assigned to one of the empire's major administrative regions. So the Gallia, Gaul and Britain, Italia and Africa, the Illyricum, and the East. Each prefecture was responsible for civil governance of millions of subjects, collecting taxes, provisioning armies, adjudicating legal disputes, maintaining roads and cities. They became the chief bureaucratic officers of the empire, second only to the emperor. By the mid-4th century, the Codex Theodosianus, and later the Codex Justinianus, refer to the Prefectus Praetorio not as a soldier, but as a supreme civil magistrate. He was addressed as Your Magnificence and wielded legal and physical power greater than any senator. It's a remarkable transformation. The same office that once ordered assassinations, bribed legions, and auctioned emperors now regulated grain traffic in Antioch and investigated corrupt governors in Carthage. And it lasted. Even after the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 AD, the Eastern Roman Empire, or Byzantine Empire, retained the position well into the 6th century. Under Justinian, the Praetorian Prefect was still one of the empire's top officials, often overseeing large provinces and imperial finances. In fact, John the Cappadocian, one of Justinian's most controversial ministers, held the title of Praetorian Prefect of the East. He was notorious for aggressive tax reforms, ruthless administrative control, and massive building projects. Procopius describes him as both feared and indispensable, a modern echo of Sejanus, but with parchment instead of a sword. Eventually, in the Byzantine administrative reforms of the 7th century, the old Roman prefectures were phased out, replaced by the themes, military districts, and new civil offices. But you know what endured? The legacy of the prefect. A single office born in the shadows of Augustus' tent had outlived the Republic, the Julio-Claudians, the crisis of the 3rd century, the Tetrarchy, Constantine, and even the Western Roman Empire itself. The endurance and resistance of the Praetorians themselves, and especially of the Prefecto Praetorio, means something. Rome was a deep structure with strong institutions, and even the institutions that came out of corruption or ridiculous stories, like the story of Sejanus himself trying to steal the empire under the emperor's nose, well, even they endured. Even they were able to find their place in the civil structure of the empire. Because normalizing the extraordinary was one of the Roman Empire's major boons. One of the reasons it was so strong, so powerful, able to resist through some of the most unstable periods in human history, while maintaining its form, its culture, even its law. So this is it. This is the Praetorian Guard. I hope you enjoyed this, and well, subscribe if you aren't, leave a like maybe, and I'll see you on the next one. We're moving towards Augustus, so get ready for Civil War Round 2. Have a good one.